Hello, and thank you for watching this Ag Forecast video brought to you by Nutrien Ag Solutions, your premier platform for real-time global insights. I'm Andrew Pritchard, Senior Meteorologist with Nutrien Ag Solutions. Now, you're noticing you're hearing a different voice for the first time possibly in the history of the Ag Forecast video, and that's because Eric is on a well-deserved vacation with his family right now. I'm going to do my best job to do him justice here, knowing that there really is no replacing Eric when it comes to this kind of content. So, at the very least, we're going to go forward. We're going to give you a brief update here on things across primarily North America. We'll talk on the global outlook here at the very end of this video, but something kind of interesting here that really drove home the theme across the midsection of the country here, across portions of northeastern Mississippi. Yesterday, we had an MCV, a mesoscale convective vortex here, kind of meandering through the region, kicking off widespread thunderstorms that really didn't move much, such that we ended up with a portion of northeast Mississippi here that picked up 6 to 8 inches of rainfall over just several hours early yesterday morning, prompting a flash flood emergency in some areas there. This is a look at the infrared satellite picture, a loop of this yesterday morning, covering about 5 hours, and you see the very bright cloud tops just percolating in this region. And that is just, incredibly intense thunderstorms with tropical downpours parked over the same area for 4 to 5 hours. And this was really a theme as we looked across the central U.S., just these big winners, big losers, but at times the folks who did see the precipitation, it was almost too much, with some of these prolonged stationary thunderstorms producing very heavy rainfall. And again, here it is prompting a flash flood emergency for the Ecru area here in northeastern Mississippi. Here are some photos from Jacob Lanier on Twitter, again, as the water levels quickly rose in that area with just several hours of prolonged torrential downpours over one area. Shifting well to the north, Jacob M. from Lethbridge, Alberta here, 3.5, almost 4 inches of rainfall since Saturday as heavy rain, heavy thunderstorms, and at times severe storms have continued to cross portions of the Canadian prairies. And in between all that, it's been a very quiet severe weather season across the midsection of the country, across what we know as Tornado Alley. But we still had a lone storm there pop up across southwest Kansas yesterday near Satanta. This is kind of near the Dodge City area. This is about as spectacular a shot of a supercell and tornado as I've seen for this entire year. And it was on a very low-risk severe weather day where we just had the right conditions come together. The supercell popped up, produced a brief tornado there that lasted maybe 5 minutes or so, and that was about it. But luckily, we had a photographer there, a storm chaser in the region to capture a shot of that yesterday evening. So as you look at the satellite picture, this is one of my favorite animations. We get the cloud tops, and we also get the lightning activity with that. And you notice we're finally quieting down across the midsection of the country where we had a stalled out frontal boundary, several days of these slow-moving thunderstorm complexes. That pattern is going to come to an end here, and we're going to shift to a much drier, a much hotter pattern here, well advertised across the midsection of the country, and we'll dive in and kind of talk about what that looks like here in a moment. So let's look at the radar then here as we get started here early on this Thursday morning. We've got several thunderstorm clusters ongoing, one across portions of central Texas. We've got broken scattered showers and storms across portions of Montana, Wyoming lifting into the Canadian prairie, and then some very widely isolated shower activity continuing across parts of the Gulf Coast into the mid-Mississippi Valley. So you look at the last 72 hours of precipitation, again, big winners, big losers. You can see several corridors of extremely heavy rainfall here where we got north of 4 to 6 inches of precipitation, that being across portions of North Dakota down into central Minnesota, parts of northwestern Wisconsin. Another corridor here that was hit by slow-moving thunderstorms here from the portions of the mid-Mississippi Valley, western Illinois, far eastern Missouri. You can follow that down into portions of Kentucky and Tennessee, and then again across northeastern Mississippi, northern Alabama, where we saw some heavy rainfall during the day yesterday as well. Now, who did not see the precipitation? We see a dry corridor here from portions of central Iowa down into central Illinois. Recording this video here in Champaign, Illinois, where we were really left out over the last couple of days, being teased by heavy rain and thunderstorms just several counties away for the entirety of the last couple of days, it seemed. And then you head east from there, from maybe southern Wisconsin down into portions of northwest Indiana, into the Ohio River Valley here, parts of southwestern Ohio. Kind of scattered thunderstorm activity where some folks likely picked up a quick downpour, maybe an inch or so of rainfall, but then others were probably missed entirely there as these really scattered and isolated slow-moving thunderstorms moved across the region. Obviously, the big dry corridor here through portions of the southern plains in through Oklahoma and Kansas, western Nebraska, parts of eastern Colorado, and then back in towards portions of the Intermountain West, where we're continuing to watch some potential expanding drought. So as we look at calculated soil moisture, the change through the month of June, again, a very dry picture here across much of the central United States. The exceptions being, across parts of the deep south and then through the mid-Mississippi Valley, where we did see crystal ball make its way through during the first part of the month, but a lot of red shading there across the midsection of the country. And as we head into a dry pattern, that does lead to some current concern across some areas. Where would I say that I'm most concerned? And I think Eric would back me up here. Across parts of the eastern Corn Belt, Indiana and northwest Ohio, as we look at, for the next update here, with rather scattered and broken thunderstorm activity across this region, we may see some expansion, or at least not so much mitigation in that expanding drought across that region. Southern Illinois did pick up some heavy precipitation, likely some relief in that area, as well across parts of central Minnesota, where we were seeing some worsening drought in that region. Likely some relief across portions of North Dakota, where we did pick up some heavy rainfall from thunderstorm activity, and we'll continue to see that pattern favoring rainfall across this region, so likely some mitigation to the drought there. But watching for expansion of the central and southern plains drought, as again, we were quite dry in that region over the last several days. We'll be heading to a pattern that's going to be favoring, widely isolated thunderstorm activity in that area, but a lot of heat, and without widespread thunderstorms, continuing to watch for that drought to expand or at least stay the same over the next 7 days. So this is the look at the week 1 precipitation anomaly forecast from Noaa. And again, you notice the big yellow shading here. We're headed toward a very dry pattern across the Midwest, across the Great Lakes, and back into portions of the Mid-Atlantic and the northeastern United States. Where could we expect thunderstorm activity to continue? Well, that would be across the Canadian Prairie into portions of the Dakotas and northern Minnesota, continuing to keep favorable conditions in that area for more widespread thunderstorm activity, or MCS, those mesoscale convective systems at times, some severe weather possible in that area. As you head south from there, we'll keep at least isolated at times thunderstorm activity in the forecast across portions of the Central Plains. And as we head into next week, we'll be watching for widespread precipitation at times across portions of the Gulf Coast. Elsewhere, they're looking really at dry conditions as we head into the first 7 to 10 days of the month of July. So as we look at the National Weather Service hazards map here on Thursday morning, this expanding area of orange shading here, that's a heat advisory in place across portions of Texas, Louisiana, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Kansas, and southwest Missouri. And I do think that as we head into next week, we're going to start to see this expanding, including much more of the Midwest into the Great Lakes. We've also got an air quality index alert here across portions of the Chicago metro for heightened ozone layers within the lower layers of the atmosphere. So definitely heading toward a hot and dry pattern across the midsection of the country, largely or entirely because of this pattern here in the background state of our atmosphere. Again, a large ridge across the Gulf of Alaska, a trough in the Pacific Northwest, and then a building ridge here across the midsection of the country, allowing heat to expand across the midsection of the country and keeping those thunderstorms away from the region as we head into the first 10 days of the month of July. I apologize. Now, what we'll be looking for is this ridge axis that right now extends from the southern plains into the Great Lakes, keeping heat across that region. Does this ridge begin to migrate back towards the west, or at least kind of tilt back to the west? And this is something Eric covered in depth with our long-range weather analysis that was shared to the site within the last 24 hours. And at this point, it looks like as we get towards July 10th, 11th, and 12th, that right now the models, both the European and the Ensemble, they want to take that ridge axis that is originally through the southern plains into the Great Lakes and kind of at least tilt it back toward the northwest such that the axis runs through Texas up towards Montana and maybe western Canada. If we do see something like this, this sends us back towards a much more favorable pattern across the Corn Belt, across the midsection of the country, one that leads to northwest flow now. This is still a hot pattern at times. We're still on the periphery of some of this heat across the Central Plains into the Midwest, but being in the northwest flow there, we get these ridge-riding thunderstorms that develop over the top of the ridge across portions of the Canadian Prairie and the High Plains, and then ride those jet stream winds across portions of the Corn Belt. And so we see good agreement there right around July 10th, 11th, and 12th between both the European model and the GFS, which we've got over here on the right now, as we get into around July 10th, 11th, and 12th, perhaps migrating that ridge back to the west, just slightly bringing back at least the opportunity for occasional thunderstorms across the Corn Belt. So right now, not sounding alarm bells as far as, prolonged extreme heat and drought across the Corn Belt. We at least see some light at the end of the tunnel here as we get into the 10-day time frame. We'll, of course, have to watch this and watch the trends day by day and make sure this isn't the models reverting back to climatology, as this is kind of a preferred July state here by some of the models here. So there is light at the end of the tunnel as we kind of talk about a very hot and dry next 7 to 10 days across the Corn Belt, across the midsection of the country. But we'll need to watch this and make sure that it's not just a mirage here at the end of the 10 to 14-day time frame. So if we just take a look at the next 10 days, precipitation anomaly and temperature anomalies on the map here. Again, a big dry window here across parts of the Central Plains, the Midwest, into the Great Lakes and the Northeast, being accompanied by some extreme heat across that region. So in the short term, the next 3 days of severe weather forecast here, this would be Thursday, we've got Friday, and then Saturday. As we head through the day today, watching for widely isolated thunderstorms here, a couple of which could be strong from the northern plains all the way down into the Gulf Coast, kind of along that decaying frontal boundary. As we head into the day on Friday, a slightly heightened risk here across parts of eastern Montana into the Dakotas, where we've got a slight risk for strong storms associated with our more well-defined trough across that region. And then we'll continue to keep strong storms in the forecast here across the northern plains, likely each and every day as we head through the next 7 to 10 days, at least across this region here, parts of Montana, North and South Dakota, and then western Minnesota. So again, in the short term, let's look at the high-resolution NAM model getting started here on this Thursday morning. Let's go ahead and bring it back, watching again those widely scattered storms across parts of the south here, across Oklahoma, Arkansas, down into the deep south. As we head into the afternoon, where will that thunderstorm activity be most widespread? Well, there's not much focus across the lower 48. We'll watch for some scattered storms across the Northeast. We'll watch for very widely isolated pop-up thunderstorms, disorganized storm activity, really lacking any guidance or flow across the region. So it'll just be our summertime pop-up thunderstorms across this region. And then again, where we have that marginal risk, maybe slightly more organized here, a couple clusters producing some gusty winds and maybe some large hail. So as we head through Thursday night into the day on Friday, where is our severe weather risk going to be highest? It'll be across eastern Montana into the Dakotas here, where we see some more organized upper level support. Again, with the potential for those clusters of storms, our MCS type thunderstorm complexes, producing some locally heavy rainfall, some gusty winds, and maybe some large hail at times. So as we head into the overnight on Friday, we'll watch for that cluster of storms across the Dakota to begin to Dakotas, to decay and arc around that ridge here as we head into Saturday morning. We'll then watch for additional thunderstorms to pop up across this region as we get into Saturday midday and Saturday afternoon. So total precipitation from all of this over the next 70 hours, the next 72 hours from the high-resolution NAM model, again, are more widespread thunderstorm activity across eastern Montana into the Dakotas, broken clusters or pop-up thunderstorms from the Central Plains down into the Gulf Coast, and then the same thing could be true here across portions of the Northeast. Elsewhere, looking at primarily dry conditions across the Great Lakes into the Mid-Atlantic, and then dry conditions expected across portions or much of the West. So let's take a look. Let's step back then a little bit longer term look at the 500 millibar pattern here. We're looking at vorticity. And of course, where we see the brighter shading here, that's areas of positive vorticity, and where that positive vorticity is headed, that leads to upward vertical motion within our atmosphere, and of course the development of cloud cover and precipitation. So this is a wonderful map here to kind of use and diagnose where we're going to see disruptive weather. And again, we continue to have our attention drawn to the major trough here across the Pacific Northwest. We've seen little waves rotating around each other, a good display of the Fujiwara effect. If you missed that, go back and watch some of the videos here from earlier in the week, Monday and Tuesday. But with continued upper level support in this region, we're going to continue to keep that threat for heavy rain at times and isolated severe storms from portions of the Canadian Prairie into the northern plains, Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, and portions of northern and western Minnesota as we talk about the lower 48, but then across the Canadian Prairie, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, keeping severe weather in the threat or in the forecast here at least every few days as we head through the next 7 to 10 days. Let's go ahead and take the drawings off there and then just kind of slowly chug through the weekend. Getting into early next week, we're getting into Sunday and Monday, and what you're noticing now is, again, this ridge setting up across the midsection of the country. Notice the lack of anything interesting going on across this region, kind of just stagnant flow here. You're seeing at times some disturbances make their way kind of around this ridge across the southern plains, tapping into some deeper moisture near the Gulf Coast, and that's what's going to kick off that chance early to mid next week for some heavier rainfall across the southern U.S. But then as we get into the end of next week, this is the operational run here, so this is just one snapshot look here, just one run of the European model's take on this. So of course not to be taken as gospel, but what you're noticing here, we get into the end of next week, July 10th, 11th, and 12th. Notice the height lines now again, seeing that ridge axis kind of orient itself more from Texas to Montana, which sets up much of the Corn Belt in northwest flow here, giving us the opportunity to get back into a pattern that favors at least periodic opportunities for more widespread, more significant measurable precipitation. So again, I wanted to show a map here looking at 900 millibar winds. We're looking at kind of our lower level wind speeds. And just to show you what happens here across the Gulf Coast as we get into early next week, this is as we're getting into Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, starting to see some very strong flow coming off the Gulf of Mexico. So again, very tropical, very humid, moisture-laden air mass here across the deep south, and that's going to be leading to some heavier precipitation across that region as we get into early next week. This is also key, showing that we're not shutting down the Gulf of Mexico. We're not going to clear this with the front and kind of lock things down. We will keep the transport of moisture northward into the midsection of the country, so that'll keep at least those pop-up thunderstorms in the forecast across parts of the Corn Belt as we end into next week. But if we start to shift that ridge axis back toward the northwest as we get into the end of next week, keeping moisture across the region, that would of course aid in the development of some more widespread precipitation and thunderstorms as we get into the back half of that 7 to 10 day window. So again, precipitable water across the region. I just want you to notice really how we keep things really moisture laden across the deep south. Of course, this is not necessarily unusual for this time of year. I just want to point out that we're not clearing the Gulf at this point over the next 5 to 10 days. So that's going to lead to, again, the opportunity for some significant precipitation across the Gulf Coast as we head into next week, but also keep the moisture transport northward into the midsection of the country, keeping at least isolated thunderstorms on the table. So let's look at the precipitation forecast from the European model. We'll take this a bit deeper into the 10-day time frame. Again, heavy thunderstorms continuing across the Canadian Prairie into parts of the northern plains at times as we head through the end of this week into the early part of the weekend. Also at times very broken, very kind of disorganized, meandering thunderstorm activity are your garden variety thunderstorms across portions of the central plains into the southern U.S. as we head through the weekend as well. So we're taking it into Sunday now, looking at much of the same continuing across the lower 48. This is when we really lock into this dry pattern across the Midwest, across the Great Lakes, back into New England. Here we are into Tuesday now, taking it into, this is now midweek. What you're seeing here across the midsection of the country now is this just afternoon pop-up thunderstorm activity. Really, you get those cells that pop up, and if it doesn't pop up on top of your head, you're kind of out of luck because it's not going to move. It's going to go up, it's going to dump out its moisture, and then it's going to dissipate. And so it's a frustrating pattern unless you end up with that thunderstorm developing right up on top of your field. As we get into the middle part of next week, Wednesday and Thursday, Friday, going to get to July 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th. That's that time frame I keep mentioning here. This is when it looks like maybe we start to shift into a pattern here that could, again, favor more organized thunderstorm activity, slowly dipping back down to the south across portions of the central and eastern Corn Belt. Just something to watch. Of course, not set in stone at this point, but again, just kind of as we talk about the heat and the drought across the region, letting you know why I'm not sounding, complete alarm bells across the region, because right now we do see light at the end of the tunnel as we get towards July 10th and beyond, that perhaps we reintroduce a pattern that favors more regular thunderstorm activity across the Corn Belt. So total precipitation over the next 10 days, I'm just going to let the loop play. You're going to see the pattern really unfolding here, and then we'll go ahead and we'll draw some lines on there to kind of point out what I'm watching. So we're into July 8th now, 9th, 10th. There our loop ends, so let's go ahead and let's pause it at the very end of that 10-day forecast. So here we go. All of the precipitation from the European operational model here. Again, this is not exactly how it's going to happen, but our patterns are clear between now and July 12th. You notice the wet corridors. We've got the Canadian Prairie continue to be very active. We've got an extension of that down into the northern plains. We've got our heavy rainfall across portions of the Gulf Coast as we get into next week. At times, broken thunderstorm activity connecting these two regions here across the central plains. And then our big dry window here across the midsection of the Corn Belt, the Great Lakes here, parts of Iowa, getting into Illinois, southern Wisconsin, Michigan, Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky, back into portions of the mid-Atlantic. You're seeing some shading there, but you go ahead and draw your attention down here. What kind of colors are we seeing? Well, They're in the, trace to a few tenths of an inch of precipitation here. Again, this is just the model trying to pick up on that pop-up popcorn thunderstorm activity as we deal with a very hot and humid pattern heading into next week. Also very dry across the west. We're going to continue to watch, for drought concerns across this region as we continue to keep the ridge potentially pivoting back toward that region, even exacerbating the heat and the drought as we head into the end of next week. So again, the next 10 days, raw from the European ensemble model, the precipitation forecast here in terms of our anomaly. Again, kind of a little corridor here from the Gulf Coast into the Central Plains and up into the Northern Plains, where we could still see at least some thunderstorm activity at times over the next 10 days, but a big dry window here from Iowa and Missouri eastward through the Eastern Corn Belt, through the Great Lakes, into portions of even Eastern Canada and New England. A very hot and dry pattern upcoming across that region, also dry as we look at parts of the West. So what I'm going to play here is a loop of the next 10 days, max temperatures from the European model, and what I want to show you, or at least draw your attention to, is once we start getting beyond that deep maroon into the gray shading, that's when we're talking about temperatures at or above 90 degrees, and as we head through the next 10 days, I'll play this loop quickly just for you, and then we'll kind of pause and step through time. What I want you to notice is, a lot of 90-degree days kind of across this region as we head through the 7 to 10 day time frame. Maybe I should kind of redraw that a little bit further to the south, but through this region, even expanding at times into the northeast, into New England, a lot of days here at or above 90 degrees with little precipitation in the forecast. And I will go through time here. This will be looking at Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Look at this weekend, 90s all the way into the Dakotas, northern Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan. Nobody saved across the Corn Belt from the 90s. Heading into next week, this is Tuesday now, Wednesday, Thursday. Something interesting happens here as we get towards the end. Friday, Saturday, here we are at the 10-day. Now you're starting to see that reflection of that potential pattern change that some of the models are beginning to advertise here, where you're seeing the axis of the heat kind of reorienting itself back toward the northwest. And again, this could potentially set us up with a pattern that favors more thunderstorm activity riding over the top of that ridge through portions of the central and eastern Corn Belt into the Great Lakes, potentially bringing an end to the very hot and dry pattern, at least temporarily. So high temperatures over the next 7 days, again, a lot of 80s and 90s. You don't see much change as we just kind of click through the next several days. If anything, as we get towards the end of the loop, you're going to see the heat kind of begin to grow as we get here into Tuesday and Wednesday, starting to see some of those upper 90s across portions of the Central Plains, getting into the lower to mid 90s across the Eastern Corn Belt. So just briefly talking about Europe, again, we're starting to watch for the potential for some Black Sea heat and drought across this region as we enter a dry pattern, accompanied by some extreme heat in there. And then as we look at China, continuing to watch for Mayu front flooding with slightly more favorable conditions as you head off toward the north across the Beijing area. So with that, we're going to go ahead and end this video. Again, Eric will still be on vacation next week. I will be putting out updates as far as regional content goes, so if you're in the Corn Belt, you can still catch my forecast there on Tuesday and Friday mornings. And again, of course, yesterday, I've been talking about tomorrow, Friday morning, and then Tuesday and Friday morning of next week. So you can get some details here. I'm going to be watching the position of that ridge. Does it begin to pivot back toward the northwest? Do we start to reintroduce thunderstorms to the Corn Belt? That'll be one of my biggest focuses here over the next 7 days. So it's been a pleasure talking to you this morning. Again, I hope that I was able to do Eric a little bit of justice. Hope you have a great rest of your week and a great weekend, a great holiday weekend. Take it safe, stay cool. We'll talk to you all again next week.